I asked Brother Ken to read from Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy was clear back in the time of Moses, about 1,400 years before the time of Jesus. And Moses had brought them out of the land. The generation that he led out rebelled, and so God allowed them to die in the wilderness, 40 years of wandering around. And now they're ready to come into the land. And so Deuteronomy, Moses gathers the second generation and he lectures them. It's a series of 5 speeches, sermons, lectures, fatherly talks that he gave to this second generation of what they needed to do. And part of that, he comes into verse 17, or chapter 17, and he begins talking about when you come into the land and you possess it, and you ask, we want a king so we can be like all of the nations around about us. Now, the amazing thing is, God's saying that through Moses, 1400 BC, and we're not going to get to a king until almost 1000 BC. Now, we've been a country a little over 200 years, double that, and that's how long a spread it's going to be. And yet God knew that's what they were going to ask. And God knew what was going to happen. And God knew what happens when you put one man in power. It is hard. Being a leader is so difficult because leaders forget they're leading people. And it's not about them, it's about the people. And we've watched this with king after king after king. We've watched it with presidents. We've watched it with elders in the church. And so God talks now about how there's going to be. But I want you to remember, as we read through the Old Testament and the New Testament, it is not the story of Moses. It's not the story of David. It's not the story of any of the people. It's the story about God. Because it's God that provides. It's God that leads. It's God that teaches. It's God that brings judgment upon the people. And so what we want to learn is we want to watch as God responds to what the people do. And so it's not so much what the people do, but it is how does God react to that? And we learn what pleases God and what doesn't please God. We learn how God hates some things and God loves other things. But it's about God and about how God responds, and He will respond to us. And so we're going to learn a little bit about our relationship with God. But this is primarily the story about what God is going to do in order that we can get to Jesus. Now, I told you, 1,400 years we got to go through this story of God dealing with generation after generation after generation, and then we're going to come to Jesus. But when God said this, it was in the beginning. God is God. We could call Him King, because a king is a ruler, and God rules over all of the earth. God rules heaven and earth. All of the things that have ever been created, God is the universal king. So even when they ask for a king, such as David or Saul, God is still the ultimate king. And they need to understand and keep God in their thoughts. And God is going to provide this human king for them. And this human king has to be one of their own people. But being human, it has some pitfalls. There's some danger involved in being a king. You know, in the story of the northern kingdom, some of the kings lasted days. A few of them lasted weeks. But in that type of turmoil where they were totally ungodly and not following God at all, it always reminded me of somebody said, well, here's the bad news, you're going to be king. Here's the good news, it starts now. But you're not going to last very long. No thanks, I'm just going to go back and take care of my sheep. Leave all that to somebody else. But this was not the way men are. We struggle with leadership and power over people. So God wants them to know that when they ask for this king, it is actually going to be a rejection of God's direct king, his rulership over them. But they're going to do that. And so he said, when you come into the land, the Lord is going to give you. Moses, not allowed to go. Joshua takes them into the land. And under Joshua, they conquer both the north and the south and the middle of the land. And then Joshua dies, and they begin having judges because the people would fail. And God would raise up a leader, not a king, but a judge, a deliverer, a military might. And so for hundreds of years, they go through this cycle. They apostatize, and God raises a judge who delivers them from the oppression. And they finally get to Samuel. And Samuel was a great prophet. But Samuel's sons were derelict. And so they said, we don't want those. We want a king, so we can be like those around about us. And God gave it to them. Brethren, be careful what you ask for. Sometimes God has already told us, you don't want that. Yeah, I want that. Be careful. And so they ask for a king, and God's going to give them a king, but He warns them, you can't just pick anybody. I will pick which one I want. And so you must anoint the one that the Lord chooses for them. And then He warns, when you pick this man, and this man now has all authority over all of my people, he must not. Do you all know what must not means? I'm going to preach a lesson on that one of these days, because people don't understand. God says he must not. 3 things. The first one, acquire horses for himself. Their power was not in their army, their power was in God. Their protection was not in having a good army with a cavalry. Their protection is going to come from God. God has brought them out. He destroyed Egypt. He destroyed the nations round about them. He gave them the land. God is their king, their ruler, their army. But they're going to ask, but don't rely on that. The king must rely upon God and that protection, not the horses. Since the Lord has said, you shall never return to Egypt again, and he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart be turned away. Now you go back to the beginning, and God created man and woman. And Jesus said, and for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, singular. And the two, not 3 or 4, the two shall become one flesh. And in that unity, they then can have children and raise them up unto the Lord. And that unity is one man with one wife and the joining together. But we're going to watch these kings. They don't do that. So watch. But what God wanted was set the example. One man, one wife, one unit. The people will learn. But then the third thing, does not need to acquire an excess of silver and gold. Yeah, but it costs lots of money to be me. Somebody said that one time. Well, if you were Solomon and you were feeding all those people that were serving in your court and taking care of your horses that you had, you're going to have lots and lots of money. And so this was one of the danger, because as the New Testament says, the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. And if we set our heart on money and things, Jesus said you cannot serve God and money. And so if the king now has set his heart upon money and good, and you know, when we start watching the kings, the majority of the kings failed in these very things. They didn't listen. He must not acquire horses, he must not acquire many wives, and he must not acquire an excess of gold and silver. So, when he sits on the throne, he shall write for himself a law approved by the Levitical priest, double checked. Make sure he didn't change anything. Make sure he didn't leave this section out. And so having this book and having a double check for accuracy to know exactly what God has said, this is how you shall do that, then it shall be with him and he shall read it all the days of his life. Now, that may have just been the book of Deuteronomy. I have a feeling it was Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But even if it was just the book of Deuteronomy, he's supposed to read it, and read it, and read it, and read it. Because only then would he develop a fear, a respect for God. What did God do when the people rebelled? Did God provide for them when they were in danger? Did God promise anything and then keep it? Did God promise anything and then not keep it? And so, how do we learn this about God? And so, if the king is going to be the ruler of God's people, he's supposed to be this paramount of an example. Reading the book and reading the book and reading the book and doing exactly what it says in order that he would fear God, keeping all the words of the law and the statutes and doing them. So he writes this book. He takes it with him. He reads it morning and nighttime. And he learns to fear God, and he learns to be the example of keeping this. And that will keep his heart from being lifted up. Do you know how heady it is to be named king? The people give you authority to make all the rules. What rules are you going to make? They give you the authority to command the people to do the various things and not do that. What are you going to command? Are you going to use that power for your benefit? Or will you start off like Solomon started off and say, give me wisdom because I know these are your people. And it starts off that way, but very few kings can keep it that way. But God says, here's how you keep it. You make you a copy of the book and you read it, and you read it, and you read it. So that you were reminded of these very things. Because if you don't, you will turn aside. You will go to the left or to the right, but you won't stay with the book. And you know, start reading 1st and 2nd Kings. They went to the left and right. They didn't read the book. In fact, most of the kings never made a copy. In fact, most of the kings never even heard of it. It got lost. And you know, you read the book and it's awful. And these are God's people? Well, they're supposed to be, but they're not acting like it. They're not being what they say. And if he had kept it, then he can continue ruling for a long time, and his people will rule for a long time. Because God will protect them. God's ways are best. And they didn't. And they were destroyed. So we start and we begin reading. And God gave them Saul. And then he gave them David. And then he gave them Solomon. And Solomon had a son by the name of Rehoboam. And he really went to the left. And so the people said, we don't want you anymore. And they took Jeroboam and made Jeroboam king of the 10 of the tribes in the north. And Judah stayed down in the south with all of the kings from David's lineage. But as you read them, every one of the kings in the north was wicked, ungodly. They followed in the steps of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who taught them to sin. That verse, by the way, is quoted over and over and over concerning the kings of Israel. And then you turn and you're going, well, these are the sons of David, surely. And my answer is, surely not. Many of them aligned themselves with Jeroboam in the north. And so there were a few good kings in the south. And what made them good was they turned to God and they read the book and they followed the book. And then their sons didn't. And so the son is wicked and evil and leads the people astray. And what finally happened was God destroyed both kingdoms, destroyed the kingship. And he took them off into Babylon. And they stayed 70 years. And then God brought them back. An unheard of thing. Put them back in the land. And they established the temple of Jerusalem. They established the priesthood. They started offering the sacrifices like the book said. But you know what they never established? They never had another king. And so they're waiting and waiting. 400 years go by and they're waiting. And then an amazing thing happened. But you go back and you take a look even at the first king, Saul. He was wicked. He was a disaster as a king. He started off, and I had good hope for him when I read the opening chapter. But when he was supposed to go and meet Samuel and wait for Samuel to offer the thing, he didn't wait. He decided, I'm king, I can offer these. And God reproved him. Then he was told to go and destroy all the Amalekites because they were so wicked that they had no license from God to even exist. And he didn't do it. He killed most of them, but he brought the king back and was going to make a big ceremonial sacrifice, supposedly, out of the king. But he didn't do what God said. And then there's that verse, Samuel said, to obey is better than sacrifice. You should have done what the Lord said. That's what Deuteronomy 17 taught us. You're to read the book and not turn to the right or the left. And Saul turned. And then, having spared the Amalekites, he realized God had rejected him from being king. And so he chased David all over the land. Tried to kill him on multiple occasions. Rejecting God's choice of what he wanted on that. And he ended up, since God wouldn't talk to him, he went and got the witch of Endor to try to bring Samuel back up to talk. But that was an abomination unto God. Did you see why I said Saul was a disaster? The first king. I doubt if he made a copy of the book. And I really doubt, even if he made that copy, if he ever read it. There's no indication of godliness and holiness and righteousness. So, good news is, Saul's gone and David takes over, and God had chosen David because David was a man after God's own heart. And his trust in God when the lion and against the bear and against Goliath and in all of his Philistine wars that he did, he trusted in God and not the army of that. And then, Bathsheba. And I'm going to tell you what, Bathsheba was not his first wife. She wasn't even his second wife. And the children that he had from them, and there were other wives. Do you all remember what God said not to do? Don't have many wives. I've had people bring this up and they said, well, God approved of all of this polygamy in the Old Testament. My answer is, He condoned what they did for what they did, but it's not what He wanted them to do. And so David did that. The good news about David When Nathan the prophet came in and reproved him, and Nathan said, "Thou art the man," David repented in sackcloth and ashes, and then he went and he returned and he worshiped God. But it was never the same. He had destroyed his influence, he destroyed his power. And finally he died, and his son Solomon takes over. And Solomon also has a good beginning. I'll give you anything you want. What would you ask for if you were a young man? Money and wives. No, those are out. And Solomon says, I need the wisdom to make good judgments, to judge your people righteously. What a start. And then, wife after wife after wife after wife. And they weren't enough, so he had concubines. They were like a kind of wife. 700 concubines and 300 wives, and we don't know what all. And so, did Solomon ever write a copy of the book? I wonder. Did Solomon ever read the book? Read the book of Proverbs. I think he learned it from somewhere. But he did exactly what God said not to. He multiplied wives, and they did exactly what God warned him about. They turned his heart away from God. And so there was the disobedience. The three concepts. Solomon, his stables are still historically talked about. And I've often wondered, how many horses did he have? And it didn't matter. He shouldn't have had more. You can only ride one at a time. But he multiplied the horses, he multiplied the wives, and then he multiplied the money and the gold. Wow, such a good start. And so it split into two kingdoms, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And Judah in the south had a couple good kings. But in the northern king, not one godly man to rule. And as a result, they were wicked, ungodly, even though they were in covenant relationship with God. They didn't keep the covenant. They didn't read it. They didn't understand. And so God destroyed them. And God then destroyed the northern kingdom. And then we go into what we call the quiet years. 400 years go by, roughly. And God sent no prophets. God sent no word to teach them. They had the word, if they would have read it. But they didn't. But Jesus comes along, and he is the promised son of David. I like that we put Matthew first. I don't know which books were written in which time chronologically. But Matthew makes such a fitting place because the opening verse, Jesus, the son of Abraham, the son of David. And when he was born, it was said that God was going to give him the throne of his father David. So they got a king again, finally. And if he was going to be a king, the writing of the book, the reading of the book, and the keeping of the book. Read the life of Jesus. I don't know if he actually physically wrote out a copy of the book. But I'll tell you what I know. He quoted Deuteronomy over and over and over again. When he was tempted by Satan, he quoted Deuteronomy. When he argued with the Sadducees, he quoted it. He didn't go get the book and look it up. So he did what God wanted all of the other kings to do. And he lived a righteous life, but was rejected by people that didn't read the book right, by people that didn't fear God the way they should have, even though they claimed to be religious. They rejected the most righteous man that ever lived. They crucified him and they mocked him. And after 3 days, God raised him from the dead. And then after 40 days, he ascended back up into heaven. And then he was able to tell the apostles that all authority in heaven and upon earth has been given to me. Matthew 28, verse 18. And thus in the book of Revelation, twice, he is King of kings. He is Lord of lords. There were many kings at that day and time. Some big kings, some small kingdoms. Many, many lords, quote unquote. But Jesus, King of kings. He is still King of kings. And he sat down on the throne with his Father and he rules from heaven. And we, when we were baptized, we were transferred into the kingdom of God's dear Son. Do you all realize how special we are? We're special not because of us, though. We're special because we're God's people in the kingdom that God established, that Jesus rules over. Don't ever forget, you're God's people. Go out into the world, but be God's people. Don't be the world. Don't think like the world. Don't act like the world. We're unique. We're different. Because we belong to Jesus. Somebody asked me about, why do you call yourself Church of Christ? I said, well, there's 3 reasons. Number 1, church means people, and we're a people. And of means belongs to. And Christ means Jesus. We are a people that belong to Jesus. We are the church of Christ. And so is anybody else that will belong to Jesus. And that's up to God and them. And all I'm worried about is making sure that we are. And I'll tell you, I'm a little bit wrong on this. I'm really concerned about me. First and foremost, I want to make sure I don't miss this. And I'm going to drag you along with me. That's a good thing. So, what am I supposed to do? How do I take these Old Testament lessons? A lot of times what we do is we make parables out of all of the stories. And I'm going to tell you, I can't do that. There are stories that tell us how we get to Jesus. And they tell us how the people did. And they tell us how God responded when they rebelled against Him. And how God protected them when they were without protection. There's a lot of lessons we learn. So I go back to this one. And what we have is that God instructed the people. So He told the king, write it down and read it. I don't know whether you've ever done this or not. A couple of my friends are engaged in this. They choose a book and they handwrite their own copy. Now, I'll be honest with you. My handwriting is so sloppy, I don't know that would make any difference. But I'll tell you what, it does make a difference. You pay attention. And you have a hand thing that involves with the mind thing, and that will help cement that. That's why God said that to the king. So I don't know if we're all going to handwrite a copy, but I'll tell you, in our assembly, which we control, let's read the book. We don't do enough reading. In fact, every time it talks about reading in the New Testament, it's really talking about what I call communal reading. It's not me sitting at my desk reading. It's us having Brother Ken read the text. and read it. And our lessons need to come from the book. And we need to tell these stories over and over and over again until they're ingrained in us. And so writing out a copy, I'm going to tell you, it's not said that we have to do that. The kings were supposed to, but we weren't told that. What we were told to do, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. Jeremiah prophesied, we won't have to teach the people about God because they will know God. They will have God's law written in their heart. That's what Colossians 3 is about. Have you memorized the book? Do you spend enough time that when somebody quotes, you can quote it along with them? I've watched your lips this morning, and many of you were just silently said, thank you. That means we've learned. And so we take the book and we put it into our heart, and then we get to read it all the days of our life. Do you all know how special we are in a different way? You all have a copy of the book. In fact, I don't know how many copies of the book. I have many physical copies, and then I have on my computer and on my phone probably 100 different copies. Read them. That's what it's for. Pick one and read it. And read it. And read it. That's how you ingrain that in your heart. And then we'll read it together and we will help ingrain that in our heart. And what that will develop is that will develop the fear and the reverence and the love for God. Test number 1. What's the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, your soul, mind, and strength. How do I learn to love God? Read it. Read it. See what God does. See what God provides. See what God promises us. And what we do then is pretty soon, even the greatest ruler among men is nothing. God is our King. So we read that and we reverence Him. And then, to obey is better than sacrifice, Samuel told Saul. Read it and keep it. That you can learn to keep the words of Jesus in all of your heart. The Great Commission. All authority has been given unto me. Go ye therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I've commanded. I know so many people that they were anxious to get baptized and then they did nothing. I know preachers that are anxious to baptize people, but then they never teach them to observe. Happens all over the world. But they're not doing the Great Commission. They're only doing half. And half is not doing it. And so when we get Brandon here, we ask him to come because we want him to work and to teach and to make disciples. But then we're going to help him. And I know one of the things Jeff and I have talked about and I plan on doing is if we get new people coming in, we're going to have to teach them. And I want Brandon to be busy teaching outside, and we'll take care of all the inside. And make sure. So, what have you learned this morning? God gave us His Word, and God expects us to know His Word, and God expects us to keep His Word. Your job is set before you. Go and be God's people. And if you've never obeyed the gospel, it starts by being baptized into Christ. And then we'll help you learn, because we're going to read the book together and apart. If you're willing to do that, we invite you to come as together we stand and sing.